In the year 1904, two things happened in American publishing that, taken together, changed how the country saw itself. The first appeared in the September 7th edition of Puck, a weekly magazine known for its political satire and its willingness to say, in pictures, what newspapers said, in words. An illustrator named Udo Kepler had drawn a picture. It needed no caption to make its meaning clear. A creature with the body of an oil storage tank and the arms of a giant octopus stretched across the page. Its tentacles, thick and coiling, reached in every direction simultaneously. One wrapped around the Capitol building in Washington, one tightened around the White House, others extended to the courts, to the banks, to the railroads that moved goods across the American continent. At the base of each tentacle, pressed beneath the weight of it, were small figures, ordinary people, the kind of people who read Puck on a September morning and recognized, in the image before them, something they had suspected but not yet seen drawn so plainly. Beneath the creature, one word. Next. The implication was not subtle. Standard Oil had already taken everything else. You were next. The second thing appeared across 19 installments of McClure's magazine, beginning in November of 1902 and running through 1904. It was not a drawing. It was reporting. Careful, documented, methodically assembled reporting by a journalist named Ida Tarbell, who had spent 5 years reading court records and interviewing witnesses and building, piece by piece, the most detailed public account of Standard Oil's operations that had ever been assembled. The series was called The History of the Standard Oil Company, and its effect on American public opinion was as significant, in its way, as Kepler's image, because it gave the anger that the image expressed a foundation of documented fact. 2 separate works, 2 separate publications, 2 separate creators. One, a satirist with a pen. One, a journalist with a notebook, both aimed at the same target, both landing in the same year, and somewhere in that same year, on a morning not unlike any other. The man at the center of all of it was sitting in a small wooden chair in a Sunday school classroom in Cleveland, Ohio. He was 64 years old. He wore a plain suit. He was teaching Bible lessons to children whose families could not afford to send them anywhere else. After the lesson ended, he opened a small leather notebook, the same kind he had carried every day for nearly 50 years, and he wrote down what he had given that morning. Sunday school offering, 17 cents. He recorded it carefully, in the same neat hand he used for everything, not because 17 cents was a significant sum to a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but because John D. Rockefeller had been recording every penny he gave away since he was 16 years old, and he was not going to stop now. 2 images in the press. One man with a ledger, the octopus strangling American democracy, and the old man writing 17 cents in his notebook. Both were real. That is where this story begins. Most stories about John D. Rockefeller start with a verdict. Either he was the greatest businessman in American history, a visionary who built something the world had never seen before, and lowered the cost of light and heat for millions of people who could not previously afford it, or he was its greatest villain, a man who destroyed competition, crushed small businesses, corrupted politicians, and accumulated a fortune so obscene that it forced the government of the United States to pass new laws just to contain him. Both of those stories have been told many times. Both of them have evidence. Both of them have passionate defenders. And both of them, on their own, are incomplete, because the more interesting question is not which verdict is correct. The more interesting question is how a single human being could be the evidence for both of them at the same time. How the same man who built the most powerful monopoly in American history was also, by any honest accounting, one of the most disciplined philanthropists that country had ever produced. how the same mind that designed a system to eliminate competition also funded the institutions that would educate generations of Americans long after his company was gone. That is not a contradiction that resolves itself easily. And this film is not going to pretend that it does. What we are going to do instead is follow the actual story. The one that is more complicated than the verdict. And more interesting. The one that asks not just what Rockefeller did, but why. Not just whether Standard Oil was good or bad, but what it revealed about the country that produced it and tolerated it and eventually moved against it. Not just whether his philanthropy was genuine, but what it means when one private citizen has enough wealth to reshape public institutions without being elected to anything. These are not questions with clean answers, but they are the right questions to ask. And they are the questions that John D. Rockefeller's life forces us to confront, whether we want to or not. To understand how we got here, we have to go back, not to his greatest triumph, not to the peak of Standard Oil. We have to go back to the household that made him, and to a father who taught his son to see the world in a way that almost no one else did. Before we go further, there are 3 things you should know about this story, not because they spoil it, but because they tell you what kind of story it is. The first is this: John D. Rockefeller built a company that destroyed hundreds of small businesses, eliminated competition across an entire industry, and gave one man more control over a single sector of the American economy than any private citizen had ever held before or since. That same company reduced the price of kerosene, the fuel that lit American homes at night, by 86% over 20 years. The people who lost their businesses and the people who could suddenly afford light for their children were often living in the same city. Sometimes they were the same family, benefiting in one direction and suffering in another. The second is this: in 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered Standard Oil to be broken apart. 34 separate companies would replace it. The court believed it was dismantling Rockefeller's empire. On the day the ruling was announced, Rockefeller's personal wealth increased by approximately $200 million, because the newly independent companies, now free to be priced individually on the stock market, were worth more apart than they had been together. The man the government was trying to punish walked away richer than he had been the day before. The third is this: at the height of his power, John D. Rockefeller was the most hated private citizen in America. Newspapers ran cartoons of him as a monster. Politicians built careers on opposing him. Ordinary Americans saw his name and thought of greed and corruption and the death of the small businessman. He would go on to give away, in today's terms, the equivalent of approximately $500 billion. He funded public health campaigns that saved millions of lives. He built universities that are still among the finest in the world. He did it quietly, methodically, without seeking praise, and largely without apology. None of these 3 things cancel each other out. None of them are accidents. They are all products of the same mind, operating by the same logic, across a single, extraordinary lifetime. That is the story we are about to tell. Let us start at the beginning. Chapter 1: The Making of a Machine Mind. William Avery Rockefeller was, by almost any honest measure, a terrible father. He was also, in the strange and specific way that certain terrible fathers manage to be, an extraordinarily influential one. He was born in New York in 1810, the son of a farmer, and from an early age he showed a talent for movement, for charm, and for the particular kind of confidence that allows a man to walk into a room full of strangers and leave with their money. He was large, physically imposing, with an easy smile, and the kind of voice that made people want to believe what he was saying, even when they probably should not have. He became, over the course of his adult life, a number of things: a trader, a land speculator, a traveling salesman who moved through small towns in upstate New York and the Midwest selling patent medicines, bottles of liquid that he claimed could cure cancer, rheumatism, and a list of other ailments that happened to cover almost everything a rural American family might suffer from. The medicines contained no proven treatment for anything. William Rockefeller knew this. He sold them anyway, because people wanted to believe they worked. And he was very good at making people believe things. He maintained 2 families simultaneously for a significant portion of his adult life, a fact that was known to some and suspected by others, and openly discussed by almost no one. Because William Rockefeller was a man who operated in the space between what people knew and what they were willing to say out loud. He was absent for months at a time. When he returned, he brought gifts and told stories and filled the house with the kind of energy that made his children glad he was back, even as some part of them had learned not to fully trust when he would leave again. He had a philosophy about fatherhood, and he stated it plainly. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," he said. "I want to make them sharp." It is tempting to read that as a joke. It was not entirely a joke. William Rockefeller believed that the world was full of people who would deceive you if you let them, and that the most useful thing a father could give a son was not protection from that fact, but early and repeated experience of it. He would make deals with his children and then find ways to walk them back. He would promise things and deliver something different. He would negotiate with them as if they were business partners, and he would negotiate hard. And sometimes he would take advantage of them, and he would watch to see whether they learned from it. John Davison Rockefeller, born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, was the second of William's 6 children, and the one who learned the lesson most completely. Not the lesson that people will cheat you. That was only the surface of it. The deeper lesson, the one that would shape everything that followed, was this: the world does not reward trust. It rewards preparation. It rewards the person who has already thought through every possible way a transaction can go wrong and has built a structure that accounts for all of them. It rewards control. John D. Rockefeller grew up in a household where the most important adult in his life was unpredictable, where promises were unreliable, where the ground could shift without warning, and he responded to that environment the way certain kinds of minds respond to uncertainty. He became determined to create certainty wherever he could, to know every number, to anticipate every variable, to build systems that would hold even when the people inside them were unreliable. He did not inherit his father's charm. He was quiet, careful, deliberate. He did not tell stories. He listened. He watched. He waited. And he never, in his entire professional life, fully trusted anyone he had not first observed over a long period of time. Whatever William Rockefeller was, as a man, and the record suggests he was a man of considerable and consistent moral failure, he gave his son something that turned out to be extraordinarily useful. A very early and very thorough education in the gap between what people say and what they actually do. In 1855, at 16 years old, John D. Rockefeller went looking for his first job in Cleveland, Ohio. He had a list of businesses he considered suitable. He worked through the list methodically, presenting himself at each office, stating his qualifications, and asking whether there was a position available. At most of them, there was not. He was told to come back. He was told they were not hiring. He was told, in the polite language that businesses use when they mean no and do not want to say it directly, that he was not what they were looking for. He came back anyway. For 6 weeks, he worked through his list. He dressed carefully each morning. He presented himself at the same offices more than once when he believed the situation might have changed. He did not interpret rejection as a signal to stop. He interpreted it as information about timing, and he adjusted accordingly. On September 26, 1855, a commission merchant named Hewitt and Tuttle offered him a position as an assistant bookkeeper. The salary was negligible. The work was routine. The hours were long. Rockefeller considered it the most important day of his life. He celebrated it every year for the rest of his existence. He called it Job Day, and he marked it with more personal significance than his own birthday. Because his birthday was an accident of circumstance, and Job Day was a result of something he had done. It was the first concrete evidence that persistence, applied consistently over time, produced results. He would apply that lesson to everything that followed. On the day he was hired, or very close to it, he began keeping a record. He called the first volume Ledger A. It was a small book, bound in leather, filled with the careful handwriting of a 16-year-old who had decided that the movement of money was something that deserved to be tracked precisely. He recorded what he earned. He recorded what he spent. He recorded what he gave to his church, what he paid for his board, what he spent on clothing, what he contributed to various charitable causes that he encountered during the course of his life in Cleveland. He recorded 17 cents given to a missionary society. He recorded 10 cents given to a Sunday school. He recorded amounts so small that the time required to write them down was almost certainly worth more than the money itself. He was not doing this because he was poor, though he was, in those early years, not wealthy. He was doing it because the act of recording was the act of controlling. To know exactly where every penny went was to have a form of power over it. To see the numbers laid out in sequence was to understand patterns that were invisible when you were simply living through them. Ledger A would grow into dozens of volumes over the course of his lifetime. The habit never stopped. When he was the richest man in the world, he was still writing down what he spent and what he gave, in the same neat hand, with the same careful attention to amounts that most men of his wealth would have considered beneath notice. It was not frugality. Exactly. Rockefeller spent money freely when he believed it served a purpose. It was something closer to a refusal to let anything be invisible. Every number that was written down was a number he understood. Every number he understood was a variable he could control. In 1859, a man named Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and the world that John D. Rockefeller had been quietly preparing himself for suddenly appeared. The Pennsylvania oil rush of the early 1860s looked, to most observers, like opportunity. It looked like fortune. It looked like the American frontier moving east. Like the gold fields of California transported to the hills and creek beds of western Pennsylvania, except that what came out of the ground here was not gold, but something darker and stranger, and, as it turned out, more consequential. Crude oil had been known to exist in Pennsylvania for decades. Native Americans had used it. Early settlers had found it seeping from the ground near Oil Creek and had used it as a lubricant, as a medicine, as a fuel source of limited value. Edwin Drake's well, drilled in August of 1859 at a depth of 69 feet, changed everything, because Drake demonstrated that petroleum existed underground in sufficient quantities to be extracted commercially, and that discovery set off a chain of events that transformed western Pennsylvania into something resembling a fever dream. Within 3 years of Drake's well, the region was unrecognizable. Derricks rose from the hillsides so quickly that the landscape looked, from a distance, like a forest of wood and iron. Speculators arrived by the thousands. Fortunes were made in weeks and lost in days. The price of crude oil swung from $10 a barrel to 10 cents, and back again based on rumors, discoveries, and the collective psychological state of men who had bet everything they owned on a commodity that no one yet knew how to predict. The refineries that processed crude into kerosene, the product that actually reached consumers, were small, undercapitalized, and frequently dangerous. Explosions were common. Quality was inconsistent. The kerosene that came out of one refinery might be safe to burn in a lamp. The kerosene from the operation next door might explode. There was no standard, no inspection, no regulation of any meaningful kind. John D. Rockefeller visited the oil region in 1863. He went with a partner, a man named Maurice Clark, who shared his interest in the commercial possibilities of petroleum refining. They toured the facilities. They talked to producers and refiners and merchants. They looked at the numbers. What Rockefeller saw was not what most people saw when they looked at the Pennsylvania oil fields. Most people saw chaos and accepted it as the natural condition of a new industry, something that would sort itself out over time as markets do. They saw the volatility of prices and assumed that some people would win and some would lose. And that was how it worked. Rockefeller saw a system that was broken and had not yet found the person capable of fixing it. He saw crude oil being extracted without coordination, refined without standards, transported without efficiency, and sold without any mechanism for stabilizing the price, swings that made every business decision in the industry a gamble. He saw an industry that was producing a product people genuinely needed, a cheap and reliable source of light that could replace the whale oil and coal gas that most Americans burned at night. And he saw that industry being prevented from reaching its potential by the simple fact that no one had yet built the organizational structure it required. He was 23 years old. In 1863, he and Clark invested in their first refinery in Cleveland. It was a calculated decision, not a speculative one. Cleveland had access to multiple railroad lines, which meant competitive freight rates, which meant lower costs. It had the Great Lakes, which provided another transportation option. It was close enough to the Pennsylvania fields to receive crude efficiently, and far enough from them to be insulated from the worst of the boom and bust volatility. The refinery was not the biggest in Cleveland. It was not the most impressive, but it was, from the first day of operation, run with a precision that set it apart from almost everything around it. He was 24 years old. He had his ledger, his discipline, and his first foothold in an industry that he had already decided was going to be reorganized from the ground up. He was the person who was going to do it. By 1865, John D. Rockefeller had bought out his partner, Maurice Clark, in a competitive auction, paying $72,500 for full control of the refinery. It was more money than he was certain he had. He bid it anyway, because he had calculated that control of the business was worth more than the risk of the debt required to obtain it. That calculation, and the willingness to act on it without hesitation, was already the signature of how he operated. Consider what had formed in the preceding decade, a mind that had learned, in childhood, not to rely on the reliability of others, a bit, developed at 16, of tracking every financial variable with complete precision, a temperament that interpreted rejection and setback as information rather than defeat, a trained ability to see organizational chaos where others saw simply a young and volatile market, and a discipline of patience, the willingness to build slowly and correctly rather than quickly and poorly. That was, in the world of the 1860s, oil industry, almost entirely unique. This was not genius in the romantic sense. It was not inspiration or vision or the sudden thunderclap of insight that popular history likes to assign to its great figures. It was something more durable and more dangerous. It was a specific kind of mind, shaped by a specific kind of childhood, arriving at a specific kind of moment in history, when the oil industry was large enough to matter and young enough to still be organized by someone with the patience and the capability to do it. The question was not whether Rockefeller would build something significant. By 1865, that was already clear to the people who had done business with him. The question was how far he would go. And the answer to that question would take another quarter-century to fully reveal itself. And when it did, it would force the United States of America to confront a problem it had never had to confront before. What do you do when a private citizen builds something so large and so efficient that the market itself can no longer contain it? Chapter 2. The Mechanics of Power. The first thing you need to understand about Standard Oil is that it did not win by cheating. Not at first. In the early years, from 1865 to roughly 1870, Standard Oil won by being genuinely, measurably, demonstrably better than everything around it. And to understand how that was possible, you have to understand what the oil refining business actually looked like in Cleveland in the middle of the 1860s, because it looked nothing like a modern industrial operation. Most refineries of that era were small, undercapitalized, and run by men whose primary qualification was that they had managed to scrape together enough money to build one. The equipment was inconsistent. The processes varied from one facility to the next. The quality of the kerosene that came out of these operations ranged from acceptable to genuinely dangerous. And there was almost no way for a consumer to know in advance which they were getting. Waste was everywhere. Crude oil, when refined into kerosene, produced a range of byproducts, heavier residues, lighter fractions, materials that most refiners had no use for and simply discarded. They dumped them into Oil Creek, into rivers, onto the ground. The disposal of refinery waste was not a problem that most operators spent much time thinking about, because thinking about it required capital and attention that they preferred to spend elsewhere. Rockefeller thought about it. From the first year of full operation at Standard Oil, he approached the refinery not as a production facility, but as a system, every element of which could be optimized if you were willing to study it carefully enough and invest in improvements that would pay back over time rather than immediately. He started with barrels. Every barrel of refined oil required a wooden barrel to ship it in. The barrels were purchased from outside suppliers, and they cost money. And the cost of barrels, multiplied across the volume that Rockefeller was already beginning to move, was significant. He looked at the numbers and made a decision that his competitors found puzzling at the time. He hired his own coopers. He built his own barrel-making operation, integrated directly into Standard Oil's facilities. The barrels Standard Oil made for itself cost substantially less than the barrels his competitors were purchasing on the open market. It was not a dramatic saving on any individual barrel, but Rockefeller was already thinking in terms of millions of barrels. And at that scale, the difference compounded into something very large, very quickly. He did the same thing with transportation. When the railroads that moved his product tried to charge rates he considered excessive, he did not simply pay them. He looked at alternatives. He invested in pipelines. He negotiated aggressively, playing competing rail lines against each other to drive his freight costs down in ways that his smaller competitors, who did not have the volume to make credible threats, could not replicate. He turned his attention to the byproducts that other refiners were throwing away. The heavier residues left over from kerosene production turned out to have commercial applications. Lubricating oil, petroleum jelly, paraffin wax. Rockefeller hired chemists to study these materials and find uses for them, products that his competitors were dumping into waterways. Standard Oil was selling. Every waste stream became a revenue stream. Every cost that other operators accepted as unavoidable became, in Rockefeller's mind, a problem to be engineered away. The result, by the early 1870s, was a refinery operation that could produce kerosene at a cost per gallon that its competitors simply could not match. Not because Rockefeller had access to better crude, not because he had some fundamental technological advantage that others lacked, but because he had applied a level of systematic attention to every element of the operation that no one else in the industry was willing or able to match. And the price of kerosene fell. In 1865, A gallon of kerosene cost 58 cents. It was a product that families needed, because kerosene was what you burned in your lamp when the sun went down. And without it, the night was dark, and the options were expensive. Whale oil was scarcer and more costly. Candles were affordable only in small quantities. For millions of American families, particularly working-class families in cities and farm families in rural areas, darkness, after sundown, was simply the condition of their lives. Standard Oil changed that. Not through charity, through efficiency. By 1885, a gallon of kerosene cost 8 cents. That reduction, 86% over 20 years, was one of the most significant improvements in the material conditions of ordinary American life in the 19th century. It happened because John D. Rockefeller had decided that every penny of unnecessary cost in the production and distribution of refined oil was a problem he was personally responsible for solving. The question, and it is a genuine question without a simple answer, is who exactly benefited from that efficiency, and who paid the price for it. To understand what Standard Oil meant to ordinary Americans, you have to hold two images at the same time, and you have to resist the temptation to let one cancel out the other. The first image is a kitchen in Pittsburgh in 1880. A family, working class. The husband employed at one of the steel operations that were beginning to transform that city. The wife, managing a household on an income that required careful management of every expenditure. They have children. The children need to do things in the evening, to do the schoolwork that their parents believe is the path to something better, to read, to learn, to be prepared for a world that will require more of them than it required of their parents. Before Standard Oil drove the price of kerosene to 8 cents a gallon, this family made choices about light. They burned their lamp for as long as they could justify the cost, and then they stopped. The children did their schoolwork in the diminishing hours of natural daylight when they had it. And when they did not have it, they did what they could by firelight, or they went to bed. After 1880, this family could afford to keep a lamp burning in the evening. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was the difference between a child who could study after supper and a child who could not, multiplied across millions of families, across a country that was in the middle of one of the most consequential periods of economic and educational transformation in its history. It was something that mattered enormously. That is one image. It is real. The numbers support it, and the lives it describes were real lives. The second image is a refinery owner in Cleveland in 1872. He built his operation 5 years ago, with money he borrowed from his family and from a bank that believed in him, on the strength of a business plan that made sense when he wrote it and continued to make sense as kerosene demand grew and his customer base expanded. He is not a wealthy man, but he is a man who built something, who employs workers, who has a stake in the industry and the community and the future he is trying to create for himself and his family. In the winter of 1872, he discovers that Standard Oil has made an arrangement with the railroad companies that serve Cleveland. The details of the arrangement will take months to become fully public. But the effect is immediate and unmistakable. Standard Oil is receiving rebates on its freight costs, discounts so substantial that its effective cost of moving product to market is dramatically lower than anything he can negotiate on his own. He cannot match Standard Oil's prices. He cannot compete with Standard Oil's margins. He has not made a mistake in his business. He has not managed his operation poorly. He has simply found himself on the wrong side of an arrangement that he had no knowledge of and no ability to influence. Within 3 months, he will sell his refinery to Standard Oil or close it. Those will be his only options. Both of these stories are true. They exist simultaneously, in the same industry, in the same years, as products of the same organization making the same decisions. Standard Oil gave, and Standard Oil took, usually from different people, sometimes from the same person, at different moments in their life, in different directions. This is not a comfortable thing to hold in your mind. It is much easier to decide that Standard Oil was either a great benefit to humanity or a predatory machine that destroyed everything it touched. The evidence, honestly examined, does not permit either of those clean conclusions. What it permits is something more difficult and more important: the recognition that the same system can produce genuine benefits and genuine harm simultaneously, and that the people who experience the benefits and the people who experience the harm are usually not the same people, and usually do not have equal power to determine which category they end up in. That recognition is not just a historical observation about the 1870s. It is one of the central, unresolved questions of every market economy that has existed since. In the winter of 1872, Rockefeller did something that would follow him for the rest of his life. He made a secret arrangement. The arrangement was called the South Improvement Company, and its structure was, depending on your perspective, either an act of extraordinary strategic genius or a demonstration of exactly the kind of market manipulation that makes competitive capitalism impossible. Both assessments are defensible. Here is how it worked. The major railroads serving the Pennsylvania oil region and the Cleveland refining operations, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad, and the New York Central, agreed to give Standard Oil and a small number of allied refiners substantially reduced freight rates on the oil they shipped. That alone would have been significant, but not unprecedented. Railroad rebates, preferential rates given to large customers, were a common enough practice in that era. What made the South Improvement Company different? What made it something that the oil industry remembered for decades? Was the second part of the arrangement. The railroads agreed to give Standard Oil a portion of the freight charges paid by its competitors. Every barrel of oil that a competing refiner shipped, every ton of crude that moved on those rail lines to a facility that was not affiliated with Standard Oil, generated a payment, not to the refiner, to Standard Oil. The competing refiners were, without knowing it, subsidizing the company that was about to destroy them. When the details of the arrangement leaked out, in February of 1872, the reaction in the oil region was immediate and furious. Producers in Titusville and Oil City organized. They threatened to stop selling crude to any refiner connected to the South Improvement Company. They sent telegrams to Washington. They held public meetings. The word they used, in newspapers and in speeches and in private correspondence, was conspiracy. The South Improvement Company was dissolved within weeks of its exposure. It never actually operated at full scale. The arrangement was cancelled before it could be fully implemented. But Rockefeller had already used the threat of it. In the months before the exposure, during the period when the existence of the South Improvement Company was known to him and to the railroads and to a small number of allied refiners but not yet to the general public, Rockefeller had approached the other refinery owners in Cleveland with an offer. Sell to Standard Oil, he told them, or compete against a company that has freight rates you cannot match and resources you cannot equal. The choice, he implied, was between a fair price now and an impossible situation later. 26 of the 30 refineries in Cleveland sold to Standard Oil in the space of roughly 3 months in early 1872. The period became known, in the oil industry and eventually in the press, as the Cleveland Massacre. Some of the owners who sold later said that the prices they received were fair, even generous. Some said they felt they had no real choice, that the alternative Rockefeller was describing was not a negotiating position, but a factual assessment of their situation. Some said both things, because both things were true. Rockefeller, for his part, never expressed regret about the Cleveland Massacre. He believed, and continued to believe for the rest of his life, that the consolidation of the refining industry under Standard Oil's control was not only good for Standard Oil, but good for the industry and good for the country. The chaos of the early oil business, the volatile prices, the inconsistent quality, the constant cycle of boom and ruin, was a problem. He had solved it. That the solution involved the elimination of dozens of independent businesses was, in his view, an unfortunate but necessary consequence of bringing order to a system that could not sustain itself in its disorganized state. Whether that view was a genuine business philosophy or a self-serving rationalization is another question the historical record does not answer cleanly. What it answers clearly is this. By the end of 1879, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of the refining capacity in the United States. It owned or controlled the pipelines that moved crude from the fields to the refineries. It had negotiated freight arrangements with every major railroad that gave it cost advantages its remaining competitors could not overcome. It set prices. It controlled supply. And it operated with an efficiency and a reach that had no precedent in American commercial history. In 1882, Rockefeller and his lawyers invented a new legal structure to consolidate and formalize this control. They called it the Standard Oil Trust. The trust was a legal innovation of considerable ingenuity, because it was illegal under the laws of most states for a corporation based in one state to own stock in a corporation based in another state. Standard Oil had been operating its various subsidiaries through a web of arrangements that were legally awkward and administratively complex. The trust structure solved this problem by having the shareholders of all the affiliated companies transfer their shares to a small group of trustees, who would then manage the entire enterprise as a unified operation. The trustees were Rockefeller and 8 of his associates. The Standard Oil Trust controlled, by 1882, the production, refining, transportation, and marketing of petroleum products at a scale that made it, in practical terms, the dominant economic force in its industry across the entire country, and a significant force in international markets as well. It was the largest and most powerful business organization in American history to that point. And it raised a question that American law and American political culture had not yet developed the tools to answer. What do you do when a private organization becomes large enough that the market itself can no longer regulate it? Here is the uncomfortable truth about Standard Oil at its peak. It was, by almost any conventional economic measure, extraordinarily efficient. The kerosene that Standard Oil refined was more consistent in quality than what had come before it. The price was lower, dramatically lower, than it had been when dozens of competing refiners were each running their own inefficient operations with their own redundant infrastructure. The pipelines Standard Oil built were more reliable and more cost-effective than the railroad tank cars they partially replaced. The organization, viewed purely as a machine for producing and distributing a product that people needed, worked. This is not a minor point, and it should not be dismissed. There is a serious argument, made by serious economists both in Rockefeller's time and in the century since, that the consolidation Standard Oil represented was not a corruption of the market, but a natural evolution of it. That the efficiencies of scale it achieved were real, and that consumers benefited from them in ways they would not have if the industry had remained fragmented and chaotic. Standard Oil's defenders made this argument in the 1870s, and they make versions of it today. The critics of Standard Oil, and they were numerous, and many of them were correct, made a different argument. They said that the efficiency was real, but that it was achieved through methods that made genuine competition impossible, not just difficult. The railroad rebates were not a competitive advantage that Standard Oil earned through superior operations. They were an arrangement that could only exist because Standard Oil was already large enough to compel the railroads to offer it. A refiner who was starting out, or a refiner who was operating at smaller scale, could not negotiate the same terms regardless of how efficiently they ran their facility. The playing field was not level, And it was not level by design. They said that once Standard Oil had achieved its dominant position, it used that position to control prices in ways that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with power. In markets where no competition remained, Standard Oil charged what it chose to charge, and there was no mechanism to stop it. They sent at an economy in which a single private organization controlled the production and distribution of a fundamental energy source was not a free market economy in any meaningful sense. It was a private monopoly that happened to be producing a commodity instead of collecting taxes. All of these arguments were also made by serious people with serious evidence. The honest assessment is that both sides were partially right. Standard Oil was genuinely more efficient than what it replaced, and it did deliver real benefits to consumers in the form of lower prices. It also achieved and maintained its position through methods that made meaningful competition structurally impossible. And it used the power that position gave it in ways that went well beyond what efficiency required. The deeper problem, the one that neither Standard Oil's defenders nor its critics could fully resolve, was this. American capitalism in the 1870s and 80s had no framework for thinking about what to do when a private organization became this large. The laws that existed were designed for a world of smaller enterprises in more limited markets. The political philosophy that dominated American economic thinking held that markets, left to operate freely, would produce good outcomes, and that government intervention in those markets was presumptively dangerous. Standard Oil was the evidence that those assumptions needed to be examined more carefully. It was not the last piece of that evidence, but it was the most visible and the most consequential. And it set in motion a political and legal response that would take nearly 3 decades to fully develop. By 1890, Standard Oil was everywhere. In your lamp, under your streets, behind your railroad prices, inside the political contributions that shaped state legislatures, embedded in the infrastructure of daily American life in ways that were mostly invisible to the people who depended on it. That invisibility was about to end. Because of one woman with a notebook, and a very personal reason to look. Chapter 3. The woman, the court, and the man who survived everything. Ida Tarbell was not an activist. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear, because the story of how Standard Oil was brought to public account is frequently told as a story of righteous anger, of a woman who had been wronged, seeking justice, of emotion driving action. That version of the story is not entirely false, but it is incomplete, and the incompleteness distorts what Tarbell actually accomplished and how she accomplished it. She was born in 1857 in Erie County, Pennsylvania, the daughter of Franklin Tarbell, a man who had built a modest but real business in the early years of the oil boom. Franklin Tarbell was an independent oil producer and refiner, the kind of small operator who had seen opportunity in the Pennsylvania fields and had worked hard and carefully to build something that belonged to him. In the winter of 1872, when Ida was 14 years old, her father came home from a business meeting and sat down at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. The South Improvement Company had just become public knowledge. Franklin Tarbell understood immediately what it meant. He understood it the way a man understands something that is going to cost him everything he has built. The railroad arrangements that Standard Oil had negotiated made his position in the industry untenable. He could not compete. He would either sell at whatever price Rockefeller's representatives offered him, or he would watch his business fail. He sold. Ida Tarbell grew up in a household that knew, in concrete and personal terms, what Standard Oil had done. Not as an abstraction, not as a news story about events happening somewhere else to people she did not know, as a fact of her own family's life, as the reason her father came home from that meeting and sat in silence, as the thing that had taken something he had built with his own hands and removed it from his control. She became a journalist, not an activist, not an advocate, not a pamphleteer. a journaliste, in the specific and demanding sense that the best journalists of that era understood the word. She was trained in the discipline of evidence. She believed that the way to change what was wrong was not to assert that it was wrong, but to demonstrate it, precisely and completely, with documentation that could not be dismissed. She joined McClure's magazine in the early 1890s, at a time when that publication was becoming one of the most significant venues for serious investigative reporting in the country. Samuel McClure, the editor, understood that readers wanted stories that mattered, stories that connected the large forces shaping American life to the specific experiences of specific people, and he gave his writers the time and the resources to report them properly. In 1900, Tarbell proposed a series on Standard Oil. She spent 5 years reporting it. The scope of what she attempted was extraordinary. She interviewed hundreds of people, former employees of Standard Oil, independent producers who had been forced out of business, railroad officials who had knowledge of the rebate arrangements, lawyers who had worked on the legal cases that had already begun to accumulate against the company. She read thousands of pages of court documents, legislative testimony, corporate records, and internal communications that had become public through various legal proceedings. And here is the detail that is usually left out of the simplified version of the story. Some of the materials she used came from Standard Oil itself, not through leaks, not through sources acting against the company's interests. Standard Oil, or people within it, provided Tarbell with access to certain documents and records, apparently believing that the company's story, told with access to its own internal account of its operations, would be more favorable than whatever she might construct from outside sources alone. They were wrong about that. But the fact that they made that decision complicates the clean narrative of adversary versus institution. Tarbell's investigation was not conducted entirely from outside. It was conducted, in part, with materials that the subject of the investigation had chosen to provide. Her conclusions were drawn not just from the testimony of people who had been harmed by Standard Oil, but from evidence that the company itself had made available. That is a more interesting story than the simple one, and it is the true one. In November of 1902, the first installment of what would become the history of the Standard Oil Company appeared in McClure's magazine. By the time the 19th installment ran, in 1904, the country had changed. Ida Tarbell did not bring down Standard Oil alone. It is important to say that clearly, not to diminish what she accomplished, which was genuine and significant and deserving of the place it holds in the history of American journalism, but because the accurate version of events is more instructive than the simplified one. The simplified version goes like this. A brave journalist exposed a corrupt corporation. The public was outraged. The government acted. Justice was served. That version makes for a satisfying story. It also leaves out most of what actually happened and why. The more accurate version requires understanding what was happening in American political and cultural life in the years surrounding Tarbell's investigation, because her work did not create the conditions that made Standard Oil vulnerable. Those conditions were already forming, independently, for reasons that had as much to do with the broader state of American capitalism as with anything Standard Oil specifically had done. The 1890s had been a decade of considerable economic disruption in the United States. The Depression of 1893 was severe. Unemployment rose sharply. Farmers, who had been struggling with falling commodity prices and what they perceived as exploitative railroad rates for years, organized politically in ways they had not before. The populist movement, which drew its strength from rural America's sense that the economic system was rigged against ordinary people and in favor of concentrated wealth, reached its peak in the presidential election of 1896. The populists lost that election, but the questions they were asking did not go away. They were absorbed, reshaped, and redirected into what became known as the Progressive Movement, a broader and more politically diverse coalition that shared the belief that the industrial capitalism of the Gilded Age had produced concentrations of private power that were incompatible with democratic self-government and required a political response. Theodore Roosevelt was not a progressive in the ideological sense when he became president in 1901. Following the assassination of William McKinley, he was a Republican from a wealthy family with a genuine admiration for American enterprise and a genuine suspicion of the reformers who wanted to constrain it too aggressively. But Roosevelt was also a politician of considerable sophistication, and he understood that the accumulated resentments of the 1890s had not been resolved by McKinley's victory. The public appetite for action against the great industrial trusts was real and growing, and Roosevelt, who had an instinct for where the political energy was moving, positioned himself to lead that action rather than resist it. When Tarbell's series began appearing in McClure's in 1902, Roosevelt was already looking for the right moment and the right target for an antitrust action that would demonstrate his administration's seriousness without disrupting the economy in ways that would alienate the business community. He also needed. Standard Oil was the obvious candidate. It was the largest trust. It was the most visible. It was the one that the public already knew about and already had opinions about. And Tarbell's investigation, arriving when it did, gave the public a detailed, documented, methodically assembled account of exactly how Standard Oil had achieved and maintained its position. Tarbell did not light a fire. She poured kerosene, which was an appropriate substance given the subject, onto a fire that was already burning. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed in 1890. It had been largely unenforced for its first decade of existence, partly because the political will to use it aggressively had not existed, and partly because the legal framework for applying it to complex corporate structures had not been fully developed. By 1903, the Roosevelt administration had begun prosecuting antitrust cases with a seriousness that previous administrations had not demonstrated. The federal investigation of Standard Oil began in 1906. It would take 5 years to complete. The federal lawsuit against Standard Oil was not a simple case. It involved 33 subsidiary companies operating across multiple states, thousands of employees, decades of business records, and legal questions about the nature of corporate combination and competitive practice that American courts had not previously been asked to resolve at this scale. The government's legal team spent years assembling its case. They took testimony from hundreds of witnesses. They analyzed the railroad rebate arrangements, the pipeline operations, the pricing practices in markets where Standard Oil faced competition versus markets where it did not. They built an argument that Standard Oil had used its size and its control of transportation infrastructure not merely to compete aggressively, but to make genuine competition structurally impossible. Standard Oil's legal team made the argument that had always been the company's defense. The consolidation of the refining industry had produced efficiencies that benefited consumers. The prices of petroleum products had fallen dramatically over the decades of Standard Oil's dominance. The company had not violated any law at the time its competitive practices were developed. It had simply been more capable and more organized than its competitors. Rockefeller himself was largely absent from the public proceedings. He had retired from active management of the company in 1897. Turning day-to-day operations over to younger executives while retaining his shareholding and his influence. He gave testimony when legally required to do so and said as little as possible when he did. He did not speak to the press. He did not issue public statements defending his record. He had maintained a policy of public silence about criticism of Standard Oil for decades. And he maintained it through the legal proceedings that were now aimed at dismantling what he had built. Whether that silence was strategic, a calculated decision that anything he said would be used against him, and that silence was therefore the optimal response, or whether it reflected a genuine belief that the criticism directed at him was beneath response, or some combination of both, is something the historical record does not resolve cleanly. What is clear is that the silence was consistent and complete. In 1909, a federal circuit court ruled against Standard Oil and ordered its dissolution. Standard Oil appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. The Standard Oil Trust was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was ordered to divest its subsidiary companies within 6 months. The integrated enterprise that Rockefeller had spent 4 decades building was to be separated into its component parts, and those parts were to operate independently of one another. The companies that resulted from that breakup included what would eventually become ExxonMobil, Chevron, Amoco, and a number of other significant petroleum enterprises. The names on those companies changed over the following century through mergers and acquisitions, but the corporate lineages traced directly back to the Standard Oil Trust and the court order that dissolved it. The ruling was received by the American public as a victory. The government had taken on the most powerful corporation in the country and won. The octopus had been cut apart. There was, however, a problem with that interpretation. On the day the Supreme Court issued its ruling against Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller was playing golf at his estate in Tarrytown, New York. A messenger brought him word of the decision. He listened, thanked the messenger, and continued his round. Later, he was asked by a reporter what he thought of the ruling. He said, very little. He suggested, with the studied calm that had characterized his public manner for decades, that the decision would be carefully studied and that the company would comply with the court's order. What he did not say, and what the reporters asking him questions did not yet fully understand, was that the financial consequences of the Supreme Court's ruling were going to be considerably more complicated than the narrative of justice served would suggest. Here is the mechanism, stated as plainly as possible. Standard Oil Trust, as a unified entity, had a market value that reflected the combination of all its parts. When the court ordered it dissolved, the 34 successor companies that resulted from that dissolution became independent, publicly traded entities. Each of them could now be valued by the market on its own merits, based on its specific assets, its specific operations, its specific prospects. The market, examining these companies individually, determined that they were worth more than they had been as parts of the trust. This was not a conspiracy. It was not a scheme that Rockefeller had engineered in advance. It was a consequence of how financial markets work when a large, opaque, unified enterprise is separated into smaller, more transparent, more easily analyzed components. Investors who had not been able to accurately price the individual pieces when they were bundled together could now price them separately, and the sum of those individual prices was greater than what the bundle had been trading for. In the months following the Supreme Court's ruling, the stock prices of the Standard Oil successor companies rose substantially. John D. Rockefeller, who held shares in all of them, saw his personal wealth increase by approximately $200 million. The court had ordered the dissolution of his empire. His empire's dissolution had made him richer. The American public, when the financial implications became clear, was not pleased. There was a quality of cosmic injustice to it, a sense that the system had been defeated by its own instrument of correction, that the most powerful private citizen in the country had found a way to win even when the highest court in the land ruled against him. Rockefeller said nothing. He had, after all, nothing in particular to say. He had not engineered the outcome. He had simply held his shares and watched the market do what markets do. The ruling did accomplish something real. Standard Oil, as a unified organization with centralized control over nearly the entire American petroleum industry, ceased to exist. The successor companies competed with each other in ways that the integrated trust had not permitted. The market for petroleum products became genuinely more competitive over the following decades than it had been during the years of Standard Oil's dominance. But Rockefeller remained the wealthiest man in America. He was 71 years old. He had more money than ever before in his life. He had no company to run, no monopoly to maintain, no legal battles to fight. He had, for the first time in nearly 5 decades, time. And he had a question he had been thinking about for years. A question that had been building in him, alongside the business, alongside the litigation, alongside the public hatred and the private certainty that he had done what needed to be done. The question was this. He had spent 40 years building. He had another 20 or 30 years left. Possibly more. He was in excellent health. He had more money than any individual could meaningfully spend. What was it for? The breakup of Standard Oil is usually where this story ends. In most accounts, the arc is complete at that point. The monopoly was built. The journalist investigated it. The government prosecuted it. The court dissolved it. Beginning, middle, end. The system worked. Eventually, and the man who had pushed against its limits was brought back within them. That is a satisfying structure. It is also, as a complete account of John D. Rockefeller had more significance. Deeply inadequate. Because what happened after 1911 is, in certain respects, more interesting than what happened before it, and what happened after 1911 forces a different kind of question than the ones the antitrust story raises. The antitrust story raises questions about competition and market power and the proper limits of private economic control. These are important questions. American law and American political culture spent decades working through them. And they are not fully resolved even now. But the questions raised by what Rockefeller did with the second half of his life are different in kind. They are not questions about markets. They are questions about power itself, about what it means when a private individual has accumulated enough wealth to shape, in lasting and structural ways, the institutions through which a democratic society educates its children and protects the health of its citizens. They are questions that were new in Rockefeller's time and are not new anymore, because the pattern he established has been followed, in various forms and at various scales, by the wealthiest Americans of every subsequent generation. To understand those questions, you have to understand what he built after the oil was gone. Standard Oil was dissolved. The monopoly was finished. Rockefeller was 72 years old, in excellent health, and in possession of a fortune whose scale had no precedent in American history. He had one question left to answer. What do you do with a fortune that has outlived its purpose? Chapter 4. The Greatest Giver and the Shadow He Left Behind. He could no longer dominate oil the way he once had, so he built something different. He built institutions. And institution, as he understood better than almost anyone of his era, have a property that market dominance does not. They outlast the people who created them. They continue operating, continuing to shape the world, long after the founder is gone and the original capital has been spent many times over. Rockefeller had been giving money away since he was 16 years old, since the days of Ledger A and 17-cent donations to Sunday school collections. This was not a late-life conversion prompted by guilt or by the desire to rehabilitate his public image. The philanthropy ran parallel to the business for the entire length of his career. In the years when Standard Oil was at its most aggressive, when the Cleveland massacre was happening and the South Improvement Company was being put together, Rockefeller was also giving substantial amounts of money to churches, to educational institutions, to charitable causes of various kinds. The scale changed as his wealth grew. The organization of it changed. But the habit and the instinct were continuous. What changed after 1911 was that he had For the first time, nothing else to do. The business demanded no more of him. The legal battles were finished. The public controversy had reached whatever resolution it was going to reach. He had his golf and his gardens and his family. And he had a fortune that continued to grow even as he gave pieces of it away. Because the successor companies kept paying dividends and the dividends kept compounding. He turned the same systematic attention to the problem of giving that he had previously applied to the problem of refining oil. The result was the Rockefeller Foundation. Established in 1913. The foundation was not a vehicle for random charitable giving. It was designed, from the beginning, to identify large-scale problems that were solvable with sufficient resources and organizational effort, and to apply those resources with the same discipline that Standard Oil had applied to the problem of petroleum refining. The goal was not to give money to good causes. The goal was to produce measurable results. The first major campaign the Foundation undertook illustrates the logic precisely. Hookworm disease was, in the early 20th century, endemic across large portions of the American South. The parasite infected millions of people, draining their energy, compromising their immune systems, leaving them chronically fatigued and less productive than they would otherwise have been. The disease disproportionately affected poor rural communities, and in those communities it had been present for so long that its effects had been naturalized. People who were chronically tired were assumed to be lazy. The nickname for hookworm disease in the South was the germ of laziness. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, established in 1910 with $1 million of Rockefeller money, set out to eliminate hookworm disease from the American South. It was not a complicated problem. Medically speaking, the parasite had a known life cycle and a known treatment. What had prevented its elimination was not scientific ignorance, but organizational failure. The public health infrastructure of the rural South did not have the resources or the coordination to run a systematic treatment campaign across the affected population. The Sanitary Commission provided those resources. It set up treatment centers. It trained local doctors and nurses. It ran public education campaigns explaining what hookworm was, how it was transmitted, and how it could be prevented. Within a decade, the disease that had been accepted as a permanent feature of southern rural life had been dramatically reduced in the regions where the campaign operated. $1 million. A specific, measurable problem. A systematic approach. A result that could be documented. This was not charity in the traditional sense. It was applied problem-solving with philanthropic capital. It was, in its organizational logic, Standard Oil applied to public health. In 1890, Rockefeller gave $600,000 to help found a new university in Chicago. He had a condition. His name was not to appear on the building. This detail is worth pausing on, because it cuts against the most common criticism of Rockefeller's philanthropy, which is that it was fundamentally an exercise in self-promotion, an attempt to purchase the reputation that his business career had cost him. That criticism has merit as a general observation about how wealthy people use charitable giving. It has less merit as a specific description of how Rockefeller operated. He did not want his name on the gate of the University of Chicago. He did not give interviews about his donations. He did not seek public credit for the hookworm campaign or for the other public health initiatives the foundation supported. He kept his philanthropic ledger with the same precision he kept his business ledger. But he did not share it with the public. What he wanted, or at least what the evidence suggests he wanted, was results. The same thing he had always wanted. Not recognition. Results. The University of Chicago became, over the following century, one of the most significant research universities in the world. It has produced, at last count, more than 100 Nobel laureates in economics, physics, chemistry, medicina, and literature. The intellectual tradition it developed, particularly in economics, shaped how American policy was thought about and argued about for generations. Rockefeller's money made that possible, in the sense that, without the initial capital, the university would not have been founded when it was, and where it was, and with the resources it had. But Rockefeller did not control what the university did with that capital. He funded the institution and then, largely, left it alone. This is the distinguishing feature of the philanthropic work that holds up best to scrutiny, not the giving itself, which is available to anyone with sufficient wealth, but the institutional design, the creation of structures that could operate independently, pursue their own logic, and outlast the intentions and the preferences and the lifetime of the founder. The General Education Board, established in 1902, funded educational institutions for Black Americans across the South during the Jim Crow era, a period when the public education system in those states was systematically designed to limit the educational opportunities available to Black children. This aspect of Rockefeller's philanthropic record is less frequently discussed than the University of Chicago or the Hookworm campaign. It complicates the simple narrative. In both directions. It complicates the narrative of Rockefeller as purely self-interested. Because funding Black education in the Jim Crow South produced no social capital for a wealthy white northern businessman and carried some political risk. It also complicates any uncritical celebration of the philanthropy. Because the existence of the General Education Board doing the work that state governments should have been doing raises the question of why a private charity was necessary to provide what democratic institutions were obligated to provide and were refusing to provide. That question does not have a comfortable answer. By 1913, Rockefeller had given away, in the currency of his time, more money than any American in history. The Rockefeller Foundation received its federal charter that year with a mandate to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. The ambition of that mandate was not, by the standards of what Rockefeller had already demonstrated he was capable of building, implausible. Here is the question that Rockefeller's philanthropy forces us to ask. And it is not the question that most people ask. The question most people ask is whether the philanthropy was genuine, whether Rockefeller gave because he truly believed in the causes he was funding or because he wanted to rehabilitate his reputation, whether the man who sat in the Sunday school classroom recording 17 cents in his ledger was the same man who engineered the Cleveland massacre, or whether those were two separate people occupying the same body. That question has an answer. And the answer is that both things were genuine. The religious commitment was real. The belief that wealth carried obligations was real. The desire to be remembered differently than the octopus cartoon suggested was also real. Human motivation is not required to be singular. And the assumption that philanthropy must be either purely selfless or purely self-interested is not a serious framework for understanding why people do what they do. The more important question is different. When John D. Rockefeller decided that the most urgent public health problem in the American South was hookworm disease, and committed the resources to address it, no elected body made that decision. No democratic process determined that hookworm was more important than malaria, or tuberculosis, or the lack of clean water in rural communities, or any of the other serious health problems affecting poor Americans in that era. One man made that decision, based on his own assessment of where his money could do the most good. And the decision was implemented because he had the resources to implement it. The same is true of the University of Chicago. The same is true of the General Education Board. The same is true of every major initiative the Rockefeller Philanthropic Network undertook. These were private decisions about public goods, made by a man who was accountable to no one for them in any formal sense. This is not inherently sinister. The outcomes of many of these decisions were genuinely beneficial, measurably so, in ways that elected governments had failed to achieve. The hookworm campaign worked. The University of Chicago became a great university. The public health infrastructure that Rockefeller money helped build saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. But the structure of the decision-making matters independently of whether the outcomes were good. A democratic society is not simply a society that produces good outcomes. It is a society in which the people who are affected by decisions have a meaningful role in making them. When a private individual uses private wealth to shape public institutions, the people who benefit from those institutions, and the people who might have preferred that the resources go somewhere else, have no recourse. They cannot vote the decision out. They cannot hold the decision-maker accountable through any democratic mechanism. This is the question that Rockefeller's philanthropy raises. It is also the question that people ask about Bill Gates, and about the foundations funded by the technology fortunes of the 21st century. And it is being asked with increasing urgency, because the scale of private wealth available for philanthropic deployment has grown, and the capacity of democratic governments to fund public goods has, in many contexts, declined. Rockefeller did not create this tension, but he was the first American to demonstrate it at sufficient scale that it could not be ignored. He never addressed it publicly. He rarely addressed anything publicly. John D. Rockefeller Sr. died on May 23, 1937. He was 97 years old. He had outlived his wife, most of his business partners, all of his principal rivals, and the majority of the journalists and politicians who had spent careers opposing him. He had outlived the Standard Oil Trust by 26 years. He had outlived the era that had produced him by a generation. At the time of his death, he was still, by most estimates, one of the wealthiest individuals on earth, despite having given away, over the course of his lifetime, an amount that economists have estimated at the equivalent of several $100 billion in current terms. He left behind a son who would continue and expand the philanthropic work. John D. Rockefeller Jr. spent his adult life not building a business empire, but managing and deploying the fortune his father had accumulated. He donated the land on which the United Nations headquarters in New York was built, a gift of $8.5 million that placed the center of post-war international diplomacy on ground that the Rockefeller family provided. He funded the restoration of Versailles and the preservation of colonial Williamsburg. He built Rockefeller Center, the complex of buildings in Midtown Manhattan that became one of the most recognizable pieces of urban architecture in the world. The Rockefeller name, which in 1904 had been attached to an octopus strangling democracy, was by the mid-20th century attached to buildings and institutions and public works that most Americans encountered as simply part of the fabric of their world. The family's influence continued into subsequent generations. David Rockefeller, the grandson of John D. Sr., became one of the most significant figures in American banking and international finance in the second half of the 20th century, serving as president and chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and playing a role in international economic discussions that reflected the family's continuing position at the intersection of private wealth and public affairs. The Rockefeller Foundation continues to operate today. The institutions the family funded, the University of Chicago, the public health systems, the cultural and preservation projects, continue to function. The money has been deployed, reinvested, grown, and given away across 4 generations. And the structures it built have outlasted the man who created them by nearly a century. This is what Rockefeller understood that many of his contemporaries did not. A monopoly is temporary. A market position can be dismantled by a court. A fortune held in the hands of a single individual can be dispersed in a generation. But an institution, properly designed and adequately funded, can endure for centuries. He had spent the first half of his life building a machine to extract and refine oil. He spent the second half building machines of a different kind. Machines for education, machines for public health, machines for research, machines that ran on endowments rather than oil, that were staffed by scholars and doctors and administrators rather than refiners and pipeline operators. but that operated by the same logic that had always governed his thinking. Find a problem. Understand its structure. Apply systematic resources. Produce measurable results. Build the organization so that it continues after you are gone. He died in 1937. The machines are still running. Let us go back to 1904. The McClure's cover. The octopus. The tentacles wrapped around the White House and the Capitol and the banks and the railroads. And somewhere in Cleveland, Ohio, on the same morning that magazine landed on American doorsteps. An old man in a plain suit, writing 17 cents in a leather notebook. You have spent the past several hours with this man now. You know things about him that the readers of that magazine did not know. You know where he came from, and what his father taught him, and why he kept a ledger from the age of 16 until his death at 97. You know how Standard Oil worked. Not just that it was powerful, but how the power was constructed and maintained, and what it cost the people who got in its way. You know about Ida Tarbell and the court case, and the paradox of a dissolution that made its subject richer. You know about the hookworm campaign and the University of Chicago, and the decisions that one private man made about public goods without asking anyone's permission. And you know that the octopus was real, and the man writing 17 cents in his ledger was also real. And those two things are not contradictions that resolve themselves. They are the actual shape of the story, held in tension, refusing to simplify. What do we do with that? What do we do with a man whose methods helped modernize America, but whose power also forced America to defend itself against him? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine one, and the fact that it does not have a clean answer is not a failure of the question. It is information about the nature of the problem. Consider what Standard Oil actually was. Evaluate it honestly across the full span of its existence. It was a machine of extraordinary efficiency that delivered a product people needed at a price they could afford. It was also a machine of extraordinary coercive power that made genuine competition structurally impossible in its industry. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and they were products of the same organizational logic, applied consistently over decades. Was Standard Oil good for America? The honest answer is that there is no America in the abstract. There are Americans, specific people in specific circumstances, and Standard Oil was very good for some of them and very harmful to others. The family in Pittsburgh who could afford to keep a lamp burning after dark was genuinely better off because of what Standard Oil built. The refinery owner in Cleveland who lost his business to the Cleveland massacre was genuinely worse off. The country that developed the world's most productive oil industry in the 19th century benefited from the organizational structures Standard Oil created. The country that had to pass new laws and fight decade-long legal battles to bring a single private corporation within the bounds of democratic accountability paid a real cost for having allowed that corporation to become what it became. These are not answers that fit on a placard or a campaign slogan. They are the actual answers. And they are uncomfortable. And they are true. Can philanthropy redeem the methods used to accumulate the wealth that funds it? This question also does not have a clean answer. And the reason it does not is that redemption assumes wrongdoing. And Rockefeller never acknowledged wrongdoing. He believed, to the end of his life, that Standard Oil had done what needed to be done, that the industry required organization and that he had provided it, and that the benefits to consumers and to the development of the American economy were real and were larger than the costs. He was not performing humility when he declined to apologize. He simply did not believe an apology was warranted. Whether he was right about that is a question you are entitled to form your own view about. The evidence presented in this film does not point unambiguously in either direction. What it does point to, unambiguously, is the third question, the one that is not about the past. Who is the Rockefeller of this moment? The companies currently facing antitrust scrutiny in the United States and in jurisdictions around the world are not oil companies. They are technology companies. They are platforms and search engines and marketplaces and social networks. The specific industries are different. The specific products are different. The specific mechanisms of market power are different. But the underlying question is the same one that American law and American political culture spent 30 years working out in response to Standard Oil. What do you do when a private organization becomes large enough that the market itself can no longer regulate it? What obligations does a democratic society have to intervene? And what happens when intervention, however justified, produces consequences that no one fully anticipated? These questions were new in 1890. They are not new anymore. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. John D. Rockefeller was the first American to ask, at sufficient scale to demand an answer, what capitalism is actually for, not in words. He was not a man of public words. He asked it through the thing he built, and the way he built it, and the consequences it produced, and the response those consequences required. The answer that American society gave, through the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Progressive Era legislation and the Supreme Court ruling of 1911, was partial and imperfect, and took longer than it should have. It was also real. The framework for thinking about the relationship between private economic power and democratic governance that emerged from the Standard Oil case shaped American law and American economic policy for the entire 20th century. It is still shaping them. The story does not end with a resolution, because it does not have one. It ends with a question that each generation inherits and is required to work through for itself, using whatever tools its moment provides and whatever wisdom it has managed to accumulate from the moments before it. That question, in its simplest form, is this: how much power is too much? Rockefeller's life is one long, complicated, irreplaceable piece of evidence in the ongoing argument about where the answer lies. The argument continues. If the Rockefeller story raised questions about what capitalism does with power, the Medici story, 4 centuries earlier, in the city-states of Renaissance Italy, raised the same questions in a world before capitalism existed. A family of bankers who purchased a civilization. Their methods were different. Their ambitions were different. The world they operated in was almost unrecognizable by comparison. But the question at the center of their story will be familiar. How much is too much?